Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I paid my parents $600 every single week for an entire year, and I did it without complaint, without hesitation, because I believed that was what being responsible meant, that family meant supporting each other no matter what. And even though it wasn't easy for me, and I had to tighten my own budget, skip things I wanted, and sacrifice small pleasures that most people take for granted, I thought it was the right thing to do, that it would be appreciated, that it would earn me the trust and love of the people who raised me, and I didn't expect recognition, but I did expect fairness, a sense that my efforts and sacrifices actually mattered in the bigger picture of our family life, because this wasn't just money. It was my commitment, it was my way of showing loyalty and reliability, and I thought that at least those things were supposed to count for something. So when my parents announced they were taking my younger brother to Europe for the summer, and when I asked casually, genuinely, about my own invitation, hoping to join or at least to understand why I was being left out, the words they chose cut me deeper than anything I had ever heard from them, because without hesitation or apology, they told me that they didn't think I belonged, as if everything I had done, every week I had handed over $600, every effort I had made to support their lives and the household, meant nothing, as if my presence or absence didn't matter, as if I had been an optional component in the family structure, a placeholder they could ignore whenever it suited them. And hearing those words made something inside me snap in a way that was quiet at first, simmering and slow, but undeniable, because I had never been made to feel so irrelevant, so unworthy, by the people I had trusted the most. By the time I got off the phone, I had missed calls piling up in the dozens, and every new alert on my phone made my chest tighten and my mind race with disbelief, because the silence before their call was almost worse than the words themselves. And the way they had dismissed me so casually left me feeling not just excluded, but manipulated, because I realized in that moment that my loyalty, my sacrifices, my willingness to contribute to their lives and their comfort had been taken for granted in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine before, and it wasn't just hurt, it was a betrayal so deep and so personal that I didn't know if I would ever see them the same way again. I kept thinking about the year of my life I had spent pouring money into their hands, about the ways I had given up little luxuries, opportunities to travel myself, chances to save for the things that mattered to me, all to make sure that their bills were paid on time, that their plans could happen without struggle, and yet, when it came to a moment where I might actually be included in something meaningful, something that celebrated family or allowed me to be part of their lives beyond just a bank account, they decided I was unnecessary, that my presence was optional, and the sheer cruelty of it settled in my stomach like a weight I could not shift, making me realize that this was never just about money, and it was never just about the trip. Because even if I hadn't sent a single dollar, they would have found another way to show their favoritism, but the fact that I had given so much and been thrown aside anyway was the ultimate insult. I spent the next hours staring at my phone, watching the number of missed calls grow, feeling a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a sort of simmering determination that I didn't understand at first. Because the pain of being excluded was so sharp that it demanded attention, but it also sparked something else, a voice in the back of my mind that whispered that I wasn't helpless, that this situation was not going to define me, and that if I wanted the kind of respect and recognition that I deserved, I would have to find a way to claim it for myself, not through confrontation in the moment, not through tears or pleading, but through intelligence and strategy, through a plan that would allow me to take control of the situation in a way that they could never see coming. And in that moment, I felt a shift in my perspective, a realization that their casual dismissal of my value was a challenge. And challenges were something I had never been good at ignoring. By the end of the night, after dozens of unanswered calls, after rereading their text one more time, after letting the shock and humiliation settle into a dull ache in my chest, I made a decision that would define the next few weeks of my life. Because I knew that simply being hurt or angry was not enough, and that if I wanted them to truly understand what they had done, I had to act in a way that was precise, controlled, and unmistakably clever, a way that would force them to reckon with their own choices and their own bias, and the thought that I could do it, that I could turn their casual cruelty into a lesson that they would never forget, made the anger in my chest settle into a sort of determined calm. Because I had spent a year giving them $600 every week, and now it was time for them to see that I was not someone to be dismissed, that I was someone who could and would turn the tables in a way that was brilliant, deliberate, and unforgettable. After the shock of being told I didn't belong, I spent the next day in a fog of disbelief and simmering anger, replaying their words over and over in my mind as if hearing them differently each time might soften the blow or make sense of their cruelty. But every repetition only strengthened the sense of betrayal and made it impossible to return to normal conversations or pretend that nothing had happened, because I realized that the people I had trusted most had not only ignored my efforts, my sacrifices, and my loyalty, but had deliberately excluded me from something they knew I wanted to be part of, and that knowledge, combined with the callous way they had delivered it, sparked a determination in me that I had never felt before. A drive to turn their assumptions about me into a mistake they would regret more than anything else in the world. I began the day by going through my bank statements, making careful notes of every transaction, every payment I had made to them, and the amounts I had set aside to make their lives easier, all while thinking about the ways they had treated my brother differently. And I realized that it was not just a one-time exclusion, but a consistent pattern, a subtle and sometimes blatant favoritism that had gone unchecked for years, and the more I analyzed it, the more I understood that the imbalance of effort and attention had always been in my favor without recognition, and that their casual dismissal of my contributions and my presence had been a recurring reality I had allowed because I wanted to believe in fairness, even when fairness did not exist. While reviewing all of this, I began to formulate a plan that would not be visible to them at first, because acting impulsively in anger would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me react emotionally, and I wanted this to be different. I wanted the payoff to be clean, precise, and undeniable, something that would make them understand, in a way that could not be ignored or explained away, that their assumptions about my place in the family were wrong, and that I had been underestimated in a way that they could not recover from, and as I sketched out the first steps of my approach, I realized that this required patience, observation, and strategic action, because I had to gather all the pieces, all the small details that would make the endgame airtight. And I could not afford a single misstep, not because I feared failure, but because I wanted the impact to be complete and unarguable. By late afternoon, I had begun to test the waters, sending emails and making subtle inquiries about family accounts, subscriptions, and investments that they had always assumed I had no interest in. Making small adjustments that seemed insignificant to anyone else, but were carefully designed to set the stage for larger moves later on. And while they continued to ignore my calls and texts, thinking perhaps that I had finally accepted their decision, I watched quietly as the consequences of my small, invisible maneuvers started to align perfectly, creating opportunities to reclaim control and assert my presence without confrontation, because the beauty of the plan was in its invisibility, in the fact that they would not see the steps being taken until the impact had already arrived, and I would remain calm, collected, and entirely in command, exactly the opposite of the reaction they expected from someone they had dismissed. Throughout the evening, I spoke to a close friend about what had happened, not to vent randomly, but to test the clarity of my thoughts and ensure that I was not letting emotion cloud the strategy. And as I recounted every detail, from the initial exclusion to the way my parents had brushed aside all my contributions, I felt the anger transform into a kind of mental focus, a laser-like clarity that allowed me to see the paths available to me, the weaknesses in their assumptions, the predictable ways they would react, and the precise moments when I could apply pressure to achieve maximum effect without needing to justify myself or act impulsively, because the strength of the plan depended on discipline and foresight, not brute force or emotional outburst. By the end of that night, I had a clear outline of what had to happen next, the sequence of actions that would lead to both exposure and reclamation of my position, and while they slept, blissfully unaware that the very person they had dismissed was quietly organizing every detail, I allowed myself a single thought. They had made a mistake the size of a year of my life, and when they finally realized it, The realization would hit harder than anything they had ever imagined, because I was not the person they thought they knew, and the plan I had set in motion would prove that beyond doubt, leaving them stunned, humbled, and acutely aware that underestimating me had been their most costly error. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because my mind had been working all night, turning over every detail, every slight, every casual dismissal that my parents had delivered the day before. And I realized that the first step in reclaiming control had to be subtle, almost imperceptible, because any overt move would alert them to the fact that I had been carefully observing, analyzing, and now acting with intention. And that awareness alone would give them a chance to adjust, to manipulate the narrative, to dismiss me again before I could gain any advantage. So I began by reviewing the accounts and obligations I had quietly maintained, the funds I had contributed for utilities, the money I had sent for household needs, the subscriptions and recurring expenses that I had never once questioned or interfered with. And I started identifying the areas where even a small intervention could create immediate awareness of my presence without them realizing the full scope of what I was capable of. I began with the smallest, almost innocuous moves, canceling a few recurring payments that were no longer necessary, redirecting certain responsibilities in a way that seemed random, but was actually calculated, and monitoring their reactions without revealing myself, because the power of these adjustments lay in their subtlety, in the fact that I was creating ripples that would become waves once I reached the pivotal point of my plan, and every observation, every muted response, every flustered call or confused question that I received allowed me to refine my next steps, ensuring that the chain of events I was orchestrating would unfold exactly as I envisioned, leaving them scrambling to understand how someone they had dismissed so completely could suddenly appear to control elements they had always assumed were beyond my reach. By mid-morning, I started reaching out to a few third parties who were indirectly connected to the family finances, not to solicit assistance, but to gather information that would give me a clearer picture of how decisions were being made and how their assumptions about my lack of involvement had created vulnerabilities I could exploit. And as I spoke to them, I realized that the network of oversight my parents had relied on was far thinner than they believed, that they had assumed my indifference where in fact I had been attentive for years, and that gap between perception and reality was exactly the opening I needed, because it meant that even minor interventions on my part could produce significant consequences, and the subtlety of my actions would make it impossible for them to trace the changes back to me until the impact was fully realized, leaving them stunned, confused, and, eventually, humiliated by the very person they had told did not belong. Throughout the afternoon, I continued layering my actions, each one carefully timed, each one designed to leave a mark without alerting them to the orchestration behind it, and as I monitored their reactions, I noticed the first signs of unease. The slightly sharper tone in my mother's emails, the offhand remarks that seemed defensive, the small questions that were more probing than usual, and I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction, not because I wanted to cause them pain, but because I finally felt the control shift subtly in my favor, a shift that was a direct result of intelligence, patience, and awareness rather than any emotional outburst, and that realization filled me with a sense of power I had not experienced before. The kind that comes from knowing that a carefully executed plan will inevitably lead to the result you have envisioned. By early evening, I could see the first real cracks forming, the consequences of my quiet moves beginning to manifest in ways that were unavoidable, and I realized that the next stage of the plan required precision. Because the impact had to be undeniable, it had to be immediate, and it had to communicate without words that I had not been invisible, that my contributions mattered, and that my exclusion had been a mistake they would not be able to excuse or erase. And as I made the final preparations for the next day, double-checking every detail, confirming every sequence, and ensuring that there would be no chance of intervention or deflection, I felt a calm focus settle over me, a clarity that comes when long-term strategy, careful observation, and patience converge, and I knew that the moment was approaching when all of the effort, all of the careful steps, and all of the suppressed anger would be converted into a single, undeniable statement that would change their perception forever. leaving them to reckon with the fact that dismissing me had been their greatest miscalculation, and that every assumption they had made about my irrelevance was about to be shattered in the most precise and controlled way possible. By the time night fell, I had completed the preparations I needed, reviewed every possible outcome, and positioned myself to watch the results unfold without interference, understanding fully that the patience I had exercised, the care I had taken, and the intelligence I had applied would ensure that when the first true reactions came, they would be raw, unfiltered, and unmistakable, because I had orchestrated every detail with the clarity of purpose. And as I closed my laptop and set my phone aside, I realized that the next day would mark the first moment when they would truly understand that I had been present, active, and fully capable all along, and that the perception of my absence had been a lie they had created for their own convenience. A lie that was about to collapse spectacularly under the weight of my deliberate actions. By the time the following morning arrived, I was fully aware that the quiet, meticulous adjustments I had made were beginning to take effect, and I watched with a mix of patience and satisfaction as the first unmistakable signs of confusion and irritation emerged in my parents' behavior. Because even the smallest disruptions I had introduced into their routines and financial arrangements had started to reveal the fragility of the assumptions they had made about my lack of involvement, and I could sense, almost tangibly, that the foundation they had relied on to dismiss me was cracking, a foundation that I had once taken for granted myself, but now recognized as the perfect leverage point for the plan I had been constructing in silence for days. With every decision and every move intentionally calculated to produce maximum effect without giving them any forewarning, which was exactly the advantage I needed to assert my presence in a way they could not ignore or manipulate. As the hours passed, I monitored their reactions closely, noting every offhand remark, every slightly tense tone in phone calls, and every indirect question that hinted at their growing unease. Because I understood that these were the subtle indicators that my interventions were working and that their confidence in their control over both my life and my brother's experiences was beginning to erode. And I felt an increasing sense of momentum building within me as I realized that I had not only created a disruption, but I had also established a situation in which they could not attribute the changes to coincidence or mismanagement. Because the precision with which I had executed each step ensured that the pattern would become undeniable once the final moves were completed, and the timing had to be impeccable, as any premature exposure of my intent would have given them the opportunity to regroup and counteract my actions, which was precisely what I wanted to avoid. By mid-afternoon, I began implementing the next stage, contacting key people who were connected to certain services, accounts, and reservations that my parents had assumed were outside of my awareness, not to create chaos, but to gather confirmation of the vulnerabilities I had identified and to set in motion small adjustments that would escalate the consequences of my prior actions. Because I understood that the ultimate impact depended on the alignment of multiple moving parts, and I needed these components to fall into place naturally so that when the moment arrived, the effects would be unmistakable and the realization of my presence and involvement would hit without question, leaving them stunned, disoriented, and fully aware that I had been underestimated in every way imaginable and that their casual dismissal had been a serious error. Throughout this process, I maintained an outward calm that was impossible to misinterpret as weakness or indecision, because I understood that any sign of impatience or desperation would have undermined the psychological leverage I was building. And I carefully curated my interactions, both direct and indirect, ensuring that they revealed nothing about the extent of my observations and the precision of my planning, while simultaneously creating opportunities for small, seemingly coincidental disruptions to ripple through their carefully constructed routines, so that by the end of the day, even casual observers would begin to notice anomalies and question how someone who had supposedly been absent from these arrangements could have exerted such influence. And the anticipation of their reactions became almost intoxicating as I considered the clarity and inevitability of the conclusion I had been working toward. By late evening, the first tangible consequences of my actions were manifesting in ways that were impossible for them to dismiss or rationalize. As calls were returned with a defensiveness that had not been present before, plans were reconsidered, And subtle conflicts arose between my parents and my brother that were entirely unrelated to my involvement on the surface, but were in fact the direct result of the carefully orchestrated sequence I had established, and I could feel the tension in the household increasing with each passing hour, which confirmed that my assessment of their vulnerabilities had been correct and that my interventions had been executed with perfect timing, leaving me with the knowledge that the critical moment of exposure was approaching and that when it arrived, the impact would be complete, undeniable, and emotionally powerful, exactly as I had intended. As I prepared for the night, I reviewed each step of my strategy, double-checked every action, and visualized the chain of events unfolding over the next day, because I knew that even the most meticulous plan could falter without continuous attention and anticipation of their reactions. And I understood fully that the culmination of this sequence would require both patience and precision to deliver the maximum effect, and as I closed my laptop and set aside my notes, I felt a combination of calm focus and satisfaction, knowing that the next day would finally reveal the results of all my careful work, the first undeniable acknowledgement of my presence, and the beginning of a reckoning that would leave them unable to deny the intelligence, foresight, and power that I had quietly cultivated, and the moment they realized the extent of my involvement would be both swift and unforgettable, a direct consequence of the meticulous strategy one had executed without hesitation, anger, or error. By the time the following morning arrived, I was fully prepared for the moment I had been orchestrating for weeks, knowing that every subtle adjustment, every carefully timed phone call, and every seemingly innocuous cancellation or redirection of funds had set the stage for the revelation that would make my parents' assumptions about my irrelevance not only obsolete, but visibly and undeniably false. And I took a moment to review the entire sequence in my mind, ensuring that every contingency had been considered, every variable accounted for, because I understood that the power of this moment depended entirely on precision, timing, and the cumulative effect of all the calculated moves I had executed, while they remained completely unaware that I had been actively observing and quietly manipulating the very system they assumed they controlled. As I began to act, I initiated the carefully prepared communications that would trigger immediate responses across multiple channels, each message, email, and automated notice designed to intersect with their awareness at exactly the right moment, creating a synchronized cascade of consequences that would leave them scrambling to understand how the seemingly ordinary routines of their day had been so thoroughly influenced by someone they had dismissed entirely. And as I monitored the incoming alerts and responses, I could feel the tension rising, not because I was uncertain of the outcome, but because I understood the psychological impact would be far greater if the effect was sudden, unmistakable, and unmistakably linked to me. Which was exactly what I intended, because the brilliance of this moment lay in its clarity, precision, and inevitability, leaving them to confront the reality of my presence and capability without any opportunity to deflect, deny, or minimize the impact. Within the first hour, the results began to manifest in ways that were impossible for them to ignore, as calls from service providers, notifications from accounts, and unexpected confirmations of redirected obligations intersected with their own attempts to manage logistics, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as confusion, irritation, and disbelief rippled through their interactions. Because the very systems they had assumed were beyond my awareness had been altered subtly and intelligently, leaving them to question not only how these changes had occurred, but also why they had never recognized my involvement as anything more than peripheral or incidental. And I recognized the power of the moment, knowing that each frustrated question, each defensive remark, and each hesitant pause in conversation was a direct confirmation of the accuracy of my planning and the inevitability of the final outcome. By midday, my parents' attempts to regain control only amplified the effect, as they began to realize that the errors, omissions, and disruptions they were encountering were not isolated incidents or coincidences, but rather part of a coherent and deliberate pattern that pointed unmistakably toward me. And as their confusion escalated, I could sense their growing panic, not because they feared immediate consequences, but because the realization of how thoroughly I had understood and influenced. Their routine shattered the assumptions that had allowed them to dismiss me, and I felt a growing sense of satisfaction. Because this was the precise moment where strategy and execution converged to produce an emotionally and intellectually undeniable statement, the kind that could not be ignored, minimized, or rationalized. And the power of that realization was deeply satisfying because it was earned through intelligence, patience, and observation rather than emotional outburst or impulsive action. By the late afternoon, the culmination of all my careful planning was fully visible, as my parents struggled to reconcile the undeniable facts of the day with the narrative they had constructed about my supposed irrelevance and the missed calls. Unanswered emails and scrambled schedules created a tangible disruption that spoke louder than words, making it impossible for them to maintain the illusion that I had been peripheral, uninvolved, or incapable of influence, and I could see the subtle but unmistakable signs of frustration and recognition in their voices and expressions, each moment confirming that the chain of events I had orchestrated had achieved the desired psychological impact, leaving them to confront the consequences of underestimating me in a way that was both immediate and inescapable. As evening fell, I allowed myself a final review of the results, understanding fully that the combination of subtle interventions, precise timing, and deliberate disruption had created a situation in which the core message was clear and undeniable. My presence, my intelligence, and my influence could no longer be ignored, and the attempts to exclude me from family considerations, trips, and privileges had been thoroughly undermined, leaving my parents with no choice but to recognize, at least tacitly, that their earlier judgment had been a profound mistake, and as I reflected on the day, the satisfaction was complete not because I had caused harm, but because the equilibrium had been restored on my terms, the assumptions of my irrelevance overturned, and the clarity of my strategic brilliance fully revealed, leaving them to reckon with the reality of my power, patience, and careful execution. And I finally felt the deep sense of triumph I had been building toward, knowing that in the end, I had not only reclaimed my rightful place in the family dynamics, but had done so in a way that was precise, intelligent, and irrevocably effective, and the echoes of that realization would linger far longer than any words I could have spoken.